All right. So if you've gone through the material for Unit 3, you'll see that it's about writing long prose. So coming off of last week with short stories, I didn't really feel much of the need to review what is in the tutorials as far as that goes. So today's class isn't going to be particularly long, but I do, want you to feel like you have the opportunity to ask questions, whether it be through email, Google Classroom, Google Hangouts, however you want to ask questions if you come up with them. But this is just sort of an opportunity for you to write creatively. So what I'm going to do today, because of what our writing project is based off of, is I'm going to read to you just some excerpts from the beginnings of four very different books written by four very different authors. Um, I'm disappointed in myself that I only picked male authors. I think I was just trying to find short things to read over. So I'm going physical books. I'm going to read these chapters and then sort of talk about what your assignment is for this unit. So without further ado, let me get this set up and we'll be ready to go. All right. Hold on one sec. I don't think I could read with my invisible aligners in. All right. Everyone my age remembers where they were and what they were doing when they first heard about the contest. I was sitting in my hideout watching cartoons when the news bulletin broke in on my video feed, announcing that James Halliday had died during the night. I'd heard of Halliday, of course. Everyone had. He was a video game designer responsible for creating the Oasis, a massively multiplayer online game that had gradually evolved into the globally networked virtual reality most of humanity now use on a daily basis. The unprecedented success of Oasis had made Halliday one of the wealthiest people in the world. At first, I couldn't understand why the media was making such a big deal of the billionaire's death. After all, the people of planet Earth had other concerns: the ongoing energy crisis, catastrophic climate change, widespread famine, poverty, and disease, half a dozen wars, dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria. Normally, the news feeds didn't interrupt everyone's interactive sitcoms and soap operas unless something really major had happened, like the outbreak of some new killer virus or another major city vanishing in a mushroom cloud. Big stuff like that. As famous as he was, Halliday's death should have warranted only a brief segment on the evening news, so the unwashed masses could shake their heads in envy when the newscasters announced the obscenely large amount of money that would be doled out to the rich man's heirs. But that was the rub. James Halliday had no heirs. He had died at 67-year-old bachelor, with no living relatives and, by most accounts, without a single friend. He'd spent the last 15 years of his life in self imposed isolation, during which time, if the rumors were to be believed, he'd gone completely insane. So, the real jaw dropping news that January morning, the news that had everyone from Toronto to Tokyo crapping in their cornflakes, concerned the contents of Halliday's last will and testament and the fate of his vast fortune. Halliday had prepared a short video message, along with the instructions that it be released to the world media at the time of his death. He'd also arranged to have a copy of the video emailed to every single Oasis user that same morning. I still remember hearing the familiar electronic chime when it arrived in my inbox, just a few seconds after I saw that first news bulletin. His video message was actually a meticulously constructed short film titled Anurach's Invitation. A famous eccentric, Halliday had harbored a lifelong obsession with the 1980s, the decade during which he'd been a teenager, and Anurach's Invitation was crammed with obscure 80s pop culture references, nearly all of which were lost on me the first time I viewed it. The entire video was just over 5 minutes in length, and in the days and weeks that followed, it would become the most scrutinized piece of film in history. surpassing even the Zapruder film in the amount of painstaking, frame-by-frame analyses devoted to it. My entire generation would come to know every second of Halliday's message by heart. So I picked that one because it really upfront lays out conflict for you. You get the idea like, okay, so this is some sort of like post-apocalyptic dystopia that they're living in, and there's like this weird technology, and then this guy dies, and then there's a contest. So you get the idea right from the beginning, kind of what the story is going to be about. So that's Ready Player One. The next one that I'm going to read from is The Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka. Obviously, this is a translated, so there's always going to be different versions that you'll find. So like if you were to look this book up and then read it and one day you're like, man, that doesn't sound exactly the same because it's a translation, it won't always be the same. So I'm just going to read the first 3 paragraphs here. When Gregor Samsa woke up one morning from unsettling dreams, he found himself changed in his bed into a monstrous vermin. He was lying on his back, as hard as armor plate, and when he lifted his head a little, he saw his vaulted brown belly, sectioned by arch-shaped ribs, to whose dome the cover, about to slide off completely, could barely cling. His many legs, pitifully thin compared with the size of the rest of him, were waving helplessly before his eyes. What's happened to me? He thought. It was no dream. His room, a regular human room, only a little on the small side, lay quiet between the 4 familiar walls. Over the table, on which an unpacked line of fabric samples was all spread out, Samsa was his traveling salesman, hung a picture which he had recently cut out of a glossy magazine and lodged it in a pretty gilt frame. It showed a lady done up in a fur hat and fur boa, sitting upright and raising up against the viewer a heavy fur muff in which her whole forearm had disappeared. Gregor's eyes then turned to the window, and the overcast weather, he could hear raindrops hitting against the metal window ledge, completely depressed him. How about going back to sleep for a few minutes and forgetting all this nonsense, he thought, but that was completely impracticable, since he was used to sleeping on his right side, and in his present state could not get into that position. No matter how hard he threw himself onto his right side, he always rocked onto his back again. He must have tried it 100 times, closing his eyes so as not to have to see his squirming legs, and stopped only when he had begun to feel a slight, dull pain on his side, which he had never felt before. Absurd writer. So again, you getting a lot of setting, right? So we know like he's in his room, so he lives in a house, whatever, but also you get the conflict, right? Like, oh, I woke up and I'm a bug, but the big thing with that is just to pay attention to how he reacts to waking up as a bug, just like, oh, like this is kind of a bummer. So, all right. This very tattered old version of a book. Couldn't find the same cover. Didn't realize the image was going to be that short. But 1984. A good book to read. Okay. It was a bright, cold day in April, and the clocks were striking 13. Winston Smith, his chin nuzzled into his breast in an effort to escape the vile wind, slipped quickly through the glass doors of Victory Mansions, though not quickly enough to prevent a swirl of gritty dust from entering along with him. The hallway smelt of boiled cabbage and old rag mats. At one end of it, a colored poster, too large for indoor display, had been tacked to the wall. It depicted simply an enormous face, more than a meter wide. The face of a man of about 45 with a heavy black mustache and ruggedly handsome features. Winston made for the stairs. It was no use trying the lift. Even at the best of times, it was seldom working, and at the present, the electric current was cut off during daylight hours. It was part of the economy drive in preparation for Hate Week. The flat was 7 flights up, and Winston, who was 39 and had a varicose ulcer above his right ankle, went slowly, resting several times on the way. On each landing, opposite the lift shaft, The poster with the enormous face gazed from the wall. It was one of those pictures which are so contrived that the eyes follow you about when you move. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption beneath it ran. Inside the flat, a fruity voice was reading out a list of figures which had something to do with the production of pig iron. The voice came from an oblong metal plaque, like a dulled mirror, which formed part of the surface of the right-hand wall. Winston turned a switch, and the voice sank somewhat, though the words were still distinguishable. The instrument, the telescreen it was called, could be dimmed, but there was no way of shutting it off completely. He moved over to the window, a smallish, frail figure, the meagerness of his body merely emphasized by the blue overalls which were the uniform of the party. His hair was very fair, his face naturally sanguine, his skin roughened by coarse soap and blunt razor blades and the cold of the winter that had just ended. Outside, even through the shut window pane, the world looked cold. Down in the street, little eddies of wind were whirling dust and torn paper into spirals, and though the sun was shining and the sky a harsh blue, there seemed to be no color in anything except the posters that were plastered everywhere. The black mustachioed face gazed down from every commanding corner. There was one on the house front immediately opposite. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption said, while the dark eyes looked deep into Winston's own. Down at the street level, another poster, torn at one corner, flapped fitfully in the wind, alternately covering and uncovering the single word "Ingsoc." In the far distance, a helicopter skimmed down between the roofs, hovered for an instant like a blue bottle, and darted away again with a curving flight. It was the police patrol, snooping into people's windows. The patrols did not matter, however. Only the thought police mattered. Behind Winston's back, the voice from the telescreen was still babbling away about pig iron and the overfulfillment of the ninth three-year plan. The telescreen received and transmitted simultaneously. Any sound that Winston made, above a level of a very low whisper, could be picked up by it. Moreover, so long as he remained within the field of vision which the metal plaque commanded, he could be seen as well as heard. There was, of course, no way of knowing whether you were being watched at any given moment. How often or in what system the thought police plugged in on any individual wire was guesswork. It was even conceivable that they watched everybody all the time. But at any rate, they could plug into your wire wherever they wanted to. You had to did live, from habit that became instinct, in the assumption that every sound you made was overheard, and except in darkness, every movement scrutinized. Winston kept his back turned to the telescreen. It was safer, though, as well as he knew, even a back can be revealing. A kilometer away, the Ministry of Truth, his place of work, towered vast and white above the grimy landscape. This, he thought with a sort of vague distaste. This was London, chief city of Airstrip 1, itself the third most populous of the provinces of Oceania. He tried to squeeze out some childhood memory that should tell him whether London had always been quite like this. There were always these vistas of, were there always these vistas of rotting 19th century houses, their sides shored up with balks of timber, their windows patched with cardboard and their roofs with corrugated iron, their crazy garden walls sagging in all directions, and the bombed sites where the plaster dust swirled in the air and the willow herbs straggled over the heaps of rubble, and the places where the bombs had cleared a larger path and there had sprung up sordid colonies of wooden dwellings like chicken houses. But it was no use. He could not remember. Nothing remained of his childhood except a series of bright lit tableaux occurring against no background and mostly unintelligible. The Ministry of Truth, Minitru in newspeak, was startlingly different from any other object in sight. It was an enormous pyramidal structure of glittering white concrete, soaring up, terrace after terrace, 300 meters into the air. From where Winston stood, it was just possible to read, picked out on the white face in elegant lettering, the three slogans of the party: "War is peace, freedom is slavery, ignorance is strength." And then, so Ready Player One was made into a movie, And then The Metamorphosis in 1984 are just like really famous books. This book, Wool, is one that a friend introduced me to. Um, I enjoy it quite a bit. It's actually a three-part series. It's really interesting. I'm super into like post-apocalyptic stuff. I'm noticing another theme amongst what I've chosen here. Sorry, I picked these a really long time ago when I was first writing this class. And so yeah, I'm just going to read you the first chapter of this book too, because again, you get a really good idea of some characterization and setting and stuff, but there's also some conflict and things like that that come up as well. It also builds some suspense because you're like, okay. The children were playing while Holston climbed to his death. He could hear them squealing as only happy children do. While they thundered about frantically above, Holston took his time, each step methodical and ponderous, as he wound his way around and around the spiral staircase, old boots ringing out on metal treads. The treads, like his father's boots, showed sign of wear. Paint clung to them in feeble chips, mostly in the corners and undersides, where they were safe. Traffic elsewhere on the staircase sent dust shivering off in small clouds. Holston could feel the vibrations in the railing, which was worn down to the gleaming metal. That always amazed him, how centuries of bare palms and shuffling feet could wear down solid steel. One molecule at a time, he supposed. Each life might wear away only a single layer, even as the silo wore away that life. Each step was slightly bowed from generations of traffic, the edge rounded down like a pouting lip. In the center, there was almost no trace of the small diamonds that once gave the treads their grip. Their absence could only be inferred from the pattern to either side, the small pyramidal bumps raising from the flat steel with their crisp edges and flecks of paint. Holston lifted an old boot to an old step, pressed down, and did it again. He lost himself in what the untold years had done, the ablation of molecules and lives, layers and layers ground to fine dust. And he thought, not for the first time, that neither life nor staircase had been meant for such an existence. The tight confines of that long spiral, threading through the buried silo like a straw in glass, had not been built for such abuse. Like much of their cylindrical home, it seemed to have been made for other purposes, for functions long since forgotten. What was now used as a thoroughfare for thousands of people moving up and down in repetitious daily cycles seemed more apt in Holston's view to be used only in emergencies and perhaps by mere dozens. Another floor went by, a pie-shaped division of dormitories. As Holston ascended the last few levels, this last climb he would ever take, the sounds of childlike delight rained down even louder from above. This was the laughter of youth, of souls who had not yet come to grips with where they lived, who did not yet feel the press of the earth on all sides, who in their minds were not buried at all, but alive. Alive and unworn, dripping happy, sounds down the stairwell, trills that were incongruous with Holston's actions, his decision and determination to go outside. As he neared the upper level, one young voice rang out above the others, and Holston remembered being a child in the silo. All the schooling and the games. Back then, the stuffy concrete cylinder had felt, with its floors and floors of apartments and workshops and hydroponic gardens and purification rooms with their tangles of pipes, like a vast universe, a wide expanse one could never fully explore, a labyrinth he and his friends could get lost in forever. But those days were more than 30 years distant. Holden's Holston's childhood now felt like something 2 or 3 lifetimes ago, something someone else had enjoyed, not him. He had an entire lifetime as sheriff weighing heavy, blocking off that past. And more recently, there was this third stage of his life, a secret life beyond childhood and being sheriff. It was the last layers of himself ground to dust. 3 years spent silently waiting for what would never come, each day longer than any month from his happier lifetimes. At the top of the spiral stairway, Holston's hand ran out of railing. The curvy bar of worn steel ended as the stairwell emptied onto the widest rooms of the entire silo complex, the cafeteria and the adjoining lounge. The playful squeals were level with him now. Darting bright shapes sagged between scattered chairs, playing chase. A handful of adults tried to contain the chaos. Holston saw Emma picking up scattered chalk and crayon from the stained tiles. Her husband, Clark, sat behind a table arranged with cups of juice and bowls of cornflour cookies. He waved at Holston from across the room. Holston didn't think to wave back, didn't have the energy or the desire. He looked past the adults and playing children to the blurry view beyond, projected on the cafeteria wall. It was the largest uninterrupted vista of their inhospitable world, a morning scene. Dawn's dim light coated lifeless hills that had hardly changed since Holston was a boy. They sat, just as they always had, while he had gone from playing chase among the cafeteria tables to whatever empty thing he was now. And beyond the stately rolling crests of these hills, the top of a familiar and rotting skyline caught the morning rays in feeble glints. Ancient glass and steel stood distantly, where people, it was suspected, had once lived, above ground. A child, ejected from the group like a comet, bumped into Holston's knees. He looked down and moved to touch the kid, Susan's boy, but just like a comet, the child was gone again, pulled back into the orbit of the others. Holston thought suddenly of the lottery he and Allison had won the year of her death. He still had the ticket. He carried it everywhere. One of these kids. Maybe he or she would be two by now, and tottering after the older children. Could have been theirs. They had dreamed, like all parents do, of the double fortune of twins. They had tried, of course. After her implant was removed, they had spent night after glorious night trying to redeem that ticket, other parents wishing them luck, other lottery hopefuls silently praying for an empty year to pass. Knowing they only had a year, he and Allison had had invited superstition into their lives, looking to anything for help. Tricks like hanging garlic over the bed that supposedly increased fertility, 2 dimes under the mattress for twins, a pink ribbon in Allison's hair, smudges of blue dye under Holston's eyes, all of it ridiculous and desperate and fun. The only thing crazier would have been to not try everything, to leave some silly seance or tale untested. But it wasn't to be. Before their year was even out, the lottery had passed to another couple. It hadn't been for lack of trying. It had been for a lack of time, a sudden lack of wife. Holston turned away from the games and the blurry view and walked towards his office, situated between the cafeteria and the silo's airlock. As he covered that ground, his thoughts went to the struggle that once took place there, a struggle of ghosts he'd had to walk through every day for the last 3 years. And he knew, if he turned and hunted that expansive view of the wall, if he squinted past the ever-worsening blur of a cloudy camera lens and airborne grime, if he followed that dark crease up the hill, that wrinkle that worked its way over the muddy dune towards the city beyond, he could pick out her quiet form. There, on that hill, his wife could be seen. She lay like a sleeping boulder, the air and toxins wearing away at her, her arms curled under her head. Maybe. It was difficult to see, hard to make out clearly even back before the blurring had begun anew. And besides, there was little to trust in that sight. There was much, in fact, to doubt. So Holston simply chose not to look. He walked through that place of his wife's ghostly struggle, where bad memories lay eternal, that scene of her sudden madness, and entered his office. "Well, look who's up early," Martin said, smiling. Holston's deputy closed the metal drawer in the filing cabinet, a lifeless cry singing from the ancient joints. He picked up a steaming mug, then noted Holston's solemn demeanor. "You feeling okay, boss?" Holston nodded. He pointed to the rack of keys behind the desk. "Holding cell," he said. The deputy smiled, drooped into a confused frown. He set down the mug and turned to retrieve the key. While his back was turned, Holston rubbed the sharp, cool steel in his palm one last time, then placed the star flat on the desk. Martins turned and held out the key. Holston took it. "You need me to grab the mop?" Deputy Martins jabbed a thumb back toward the cafeteria. Unless someone was in cuffs, they only went into the cell to clean it. "No," Holston said. He jerked his head toward the holding cell, beckoning his deputy to follow. He turned, the chair behind the desk squeaking as Martins rose to join him, and Holston completed the march. The key slid in with ease. There was a sharp clack from the well-built and well-maintained inner organs of the door, the barest squeak from the hinges, a determined step, a shove and a clank, and the ordeal was over. "Boss?" Holston held the key between the bars. Martins looked down at it, unsure, but his palm came up to accept. "What's going on, boss?" Get the mare, Holston said. He let out a sigh, that heavy breath he'd been holding for 3 years. Tell her I want to go outside. All right, so those are my little introductions. So what the writing project is for Unit 3 is let's write a novel. If you've read through it, I'm not asking you to write an entire novel. That would be a lot. But the task is to write a chapter. So in your one lesson activity for the one tutorial for this unit, you're asked to make a plan for a novel. So use Freytag's pyramid to outline your novel and show how you'll explain the premise, introduce conflict, reach a climax point, and then neatly resolve your piece. So basically, you're kind of doing similar to what you did for the short story, except in a larger, more grandiose scale in terms of a novel or novella considering. So the task that you're doing then for writing project 1 asks you to take that information that you built in the lesson activity and then draft it into a chapter for a novel. You can choose it to be the opening chapter. I feel that that is generally the easiest because you usually start from some sort of point and develop. But if you already have an idea of some other like part that you might want to write for an idea that you have, you totally can. But then you'd want to write a paragraph that sort of explains a bit of the backstory there, just like how did we get here? What happened previous to this? And then you might have characters that aren't in that particular scene that are like important to the plot, so you'd want to explain those. So if you are not doing the first chapter, you would put a paragraph or two before your draft, just indicate like background info. Then you'll want to do a self-review for this, and then if you would like to use next week to have peer review, whether you want to share with the class or just have somebody else read your work, you can also send it to me. The only reason we're not having class next week is because I have to travel for a meeting that we're having on Thursday, but I'll still be available throughout the week to read over any papers. So if you want some feedback on it, I can do that. I would like you to write a paragraph about, your own self-review, like looking over these questions that are there. If you think that there's anything based off of reading through your first draft that you'd really like to work on, just put some sort of response there. At least a paragraph would be good. And then your final draft. And so just keep in mind all the things I'm looking for. Really want to be able to tell what your plot is going to be about. I want to know elements of setting, characterization, things like that, just to get that started. So that is really it for today. Again, if you have any questions regarding either the information that was in the tutorial or have any questions about getting started on the writing project, please just let me know. Otherwise, that's all. Thank you.